Hello, everyone. I'm Marilyn Harbur, one of the co-chairs of the Economic Justice Committee and CRSJ. As an Oregon tax lawyer for almost 40 years, I'm very pleased and just privileged as can be to present my Senator Ron Wyden. Senator Ron Wyden chairs the Senate Finance Committee, and he's a vice chair of the joint House and Senate Tax Committee. You will hear from him that he feels very strongly about tax policy and what it can do or not do for income inequality and other social justice concerns, such as affordable housing. Now, he will tell you about the DASH Act that he recently introduced. And I just want to point out that it has bipartisan support. Following Senator Wyden's remarks, you'll hear from the last panel of the day as to tax policy and what we can do to address it. Thank you.
I very much appreciate the opportunity to say a few words about the important issue of inequality in the tax code. As chairman of the Finance Committee, my view is the tax code ought to serve to give working families and everybody a chance to get ahead. That's not even close to how the tax code works today. Today, the tax code often perpetuates inequality, prohibits people of modest means from climbing the ladder. Democrats have worked hard to change that. In 2021, the expansion of the child tax credit successfully cut child poverty nearly in half. It was a proven lifeline for millions of families, particularly for Black, Latino, and low-income families. But Senate Republicans let it expire after just 1 year. My Democratic colleagues and I tried repeatedly to get the Republicans to the negotiating table to renew it. Unfortunately, they refused. I'm going to keep pushing to get this done. And there are other big issues of inequality that have to be addressed in the tax code. It was revealed earlier this year that Black Americans get audited at higher rates than others. This is yet another consequence of years of Republican budget cuts at the IRS that make it easier to audit working families than rich cheats and corporations. I secured a commitment from the new IRS Commissioner, Danny Werfel, to provide the committee with an analysis of what's going on with these audits within the next 2 months. Finally, I'm working with Democrats and Republicans together to deal with the crisis of homelessness and the severe lack of affordable housing. I have a comprehensive proposal called the DASH Act, Decent, Affordable, Safe Housing for All, that would make a historic investment in the low-income housing tax credit and would establish a renter's credit for the first time. These are the kinds of approaches that could be big milestones in helping people of modest means achieve a down payment on the American dream. I'm going to continue working as hard as I can to tackle inequality in the tax code to ensure that this country builds an economy that works for working families.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us on today's fourth panel. For those of you whom I have not met yet, my name is Michael Santos. I'm the U.S. Poverty Associate Director at Results. We're a national grassroots lobbying organization whose mission is to build the political will to end and prevent domestic and global poverty. And I'm based here in Washington, D.C. Huge thank you to Senator Wyden for his remarks, which literally and figuratively really hits close to home. I just want to go over a few housekeeping items before we move on with our panel. If you're interested in following up with our esteemed panelists today, you can get their contact information on the ABA website, along with other resources that they are sharing with you today. We'll leave some time for questions at the end of the session. Because of the great content of that our panelists will cover today, we ask that they keep their remarks within their allotted times. We'll have our wonderful Hunger Fellow Gabe Hafman in the background assisting with us to keep us on time. And if you have any questions for any of our panelists, please put that on the chat. For those of you participating virtually, or for those of you in person, we'll have staff field questions and we'll try to answer some of them at the end, time permitting. All right, so a few items to just get us oriented before we get to today's conversations on hot topics in taxes and debt. The economy has been front and center of politics and has been in the minds of millions of Americans since the beginning of COVID. The pandemic laid bare the inequalities that have existed even before COVID hit, highlighting the urgent need today to achieve economic justice and close the wealth gap. Federal tax policy is central to creating a more equitable economy, both the raising of revenues from the wealthy and corporations, and using the revenue to make major investments that support working families. The growing economic precarity made more prominent issues concerning tax equity, the urgent need to lift people out of poverty and to prevent households from slipping back into poverty, and the abuses and inequities in the student loan debt crisis and harms caused by high-cost debt traps. Now, our esteemed panelists work on different areas of the law, but we're all here today to talk about these issues. So I want to introduce all of them today, and thank you for joining us. So Kat Menifee is the Counsel for Income Security at the National Women's Law Center. Her current portfolio includes progressive tax policy issues with an emphasis on refundable tax credit advocacy and outreach. As part of this work, she investigates how tax policy can promote racial and gender equity and create more equitable tax code. Up next is Xavier Barraza, a senior associate attorney at Pebbles, Kidder, Bergen, and Robinson, a law firm dedicated to protecting Native American tribes and tribal organizations and strengthening tribal sovereignty. His broad expertise encompasses Indian housing tax, finance, tribal lands, natural and environmental resources, economic development, tribal codes and ordinances, litigation, and veterans affairs. Frank Clemente is the executive director of the Americans for Tax Fairness. Frank helped found Americans for Tax Fairness in 2012, a diverse campaign of 400 plus national, state, and local organizations united in support of a progressive federal tax system that works for all Americans. He's knowledgeable about a wide range of federal tax policy issues. And last but not least, Kat Walbeck, the Director of Advocacy and Civil Rights Council at the Student Borrower Protection Center, where her work primarily focuses on examining the student debt crisis through a lens of racial and economic justice. She previously worked in the External Affairs Division of the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Thank you, everyone. All right, so I want to dive deep on this concept of economic justice and wealth gap. My first question for the panel is, how does the wealth gap manifest in your line of work? And what does economic justice mean in your work? It will be helpful to get the conversation started if you can talk about what you're doing, what steps you're taking towards achieving economic justice. And why don't we start with Xavier?
Oh, okay. Hi, thank you very much for having us. My name is Xavier Barraza. I should say that I'm an enrolled member of the Harbur Band of Pomo Indians. I'm from Northern California. I'm a tribal attorney. I guess what that means is I work with tribes and tribal communities 100%. I think of it as small sovereign nations. We have a lot of them. So tax equity is 100% involved in everything that we do. So Indian tribes are within the United States Constitution. We're in Article 1, in two places, Section 8, Article 3, which says that, so it authorizes Congress to regulate commerce with Indian tribes. And there are other areas, the 14th Amendment, which states that Indians are not taxed under the treaty clause. So a lot of my work is specifically federal. Because it's federal and it's constitutionally bound, a lot of it has to do with Congress, and only Congress can fix a lot of it. Tribes are a higher authority than states. States are constitutionally authorized, and tribes are sovereign nations. We have treaties with the United States Constitution, the government. So it's something that we deal with every day. Typically, there are federal laws that specifically preempt tribes from taxing ability. But up until the 1980s, excuse me, up until from the start of the Constitution of the United States up until the 1980s, it was just by default that tribes were tax exempt, or at least on federal lands. But since the 1980s, states have been concurrently trying to tax resources on tribal lands, developments, finances, communities, and housing developments, especially natural and environmental resources. Most people don't know, but a third of the natural resources in the United States are within tribal lands. Almost 100% of nuclear access is on tribal lands as well. So most of the things you see, the gas that you pump, the trees that you build your homes with, are from tribes. In addition to that, states want to tax those commodities even though they're not on their land. Think of it as Canada or New York going into Canada and taxing something that's coming out of another resource. It's a separate sovereign. But they're more powerful than we are currently. They launch a lot of campaigns. We go to we're probably 20% of the Supreme Court's hearings. And we often lose a lot. That's been typical for the last 200 years. So it's something we deal with every day. What we call dual taxation for tax. We have the authority to tax any of the resources in our communities. The problem is so do states. They're increasingly have the authority to. So if we apply a tax on any natural resources or any resources coming from tribal communities, we're at a disadvantage. We lose the ability to have any advantage that we would. So we can either tax stuff, which drives businesses and corporations away and lowers our standards of living, and which you don't already know, we have double the poverty rate of the United States already at around 27%. It goes up and down from there, but never gets below that. So it's something we do every day. It's in our business development. It's as an attorney, we have to find ways to pay our fees. Most corporations do, but tribes have to figure out how much tax they're going to produce, or if they're going to tax somebody to pay a bill or send kids to college, or if they're going to have inadequate roads. And if they don't tax, then they have inadequate roads, they have inadequate schools, they have inadequate police or courts, because the funds that are taxed from states, from tribal resources, go to state coffers and they never come back. States often don't provide little to no services on tribal lands. So it's every day.
Thanks, David. Frank, do you want to go next?
Thanks, everybody. I'm with Americans for Tax Fairness, and if you couldn't tell from our name, Americans for Tax Fairness, by definition, we work on economic justice, and it's central to who we are and our soul. I think about the tax system. I don't think you can fight inequality unless you work on it. Well, you can fight inequality unless you work, but if, in a structural sense, if we're going to change the American society, you have to be working on taxes. And I say that for two reasons. One is working on taxes mean yes, you are taking from the rich. You're reducing their take-home pay, their income, and also corporations, which are by and large owned by the rich. Most people aren't aware that the richest 1%, they own 55% of corporate stock. So by definition, if you tax corporations, you're taxing the very rich as well. Anyway, to address inequality, we have two ways to do it from my perspective. Obviously, you can do it through higher wages and organizing, getting in unions, and empowering workers, et cetera. But from a budget perspective, you can tax the wealthy, you can tax corporations, so you're reducing their share, essentially, by doing that. Now, you could put that towards deficit reduction, which some folks propose. In fact, President Biden proposed a budget recently, $5 trillion in new revenue, $3 trillion going to deficit reduction. Or you can do 100% that would go to improving human needs, giving people the low-income housing you were talking about. Kat's going to talk about expanding the child tax credit, free pre-K. President Biden just recently put forward a budget that is free pre-K for all 4-year-olds, paid for by taxing the wealthy. You can go down the line. The bill that passed last year, the Inflation Reduction Act, it was supposed to be a big bill, a couple of $1 trillion. It ended up being $500 billion bill, which is still a lot of money, but it's relatively small compared to the need. Most of the money, $400 billion of that, is devoted to improving the environment, a clean energy economy, helping lower costs of energy for folks. But it could have also gone, or differently gone to core human needs, but that was a choice. We couldn't get that through. So by definition, this work is about addressing income inequality, shifting the balance, and it's our whole mindset is about the richest 1% versus everybody else, or big corporations, many of which pay. Actually, the Government Accountability Office, which is kind of our big watchdog, they did a report recently, and they said that since the Trump tax cuts passed in 2017, the corporate tax rate's about 9 percentage points. Okay, the average tax rate for American is 14%. So we, on an average basis, we are paying a lot more than your big corporation. And some corporations like Amazon, some years will pay nothing. And to create, I'm animated by, I want to create an economy that works for all of us. And to do that, for me, a minimum is we need to raise $10 trillion on top of what the government already raises. President Biden, as I said, he just proposed a budget that would raise $5 trillion. He's putting about $2.8 trillion into improving Medicare, pre-K, childcare, expanded child tax credit, some housing money, things like that. But we need to do much more than that to just give people the chance, the opportunities to have a decent life, and to succeed. And that would take at least $10 trillion to do that. We're in this kind of zero-sum game. We do have substantial deficits. And whether you care about the deficit or not, the fact is it is what animates a section of of Congress, of lawmaking, and we're going to see it in a big way with the Republicans in control of the House in this Congress. I mean, they're going to take us right to the edge on the debt limit. They may even go over the edge. But we kind of learned through the whole tax fight over the last 2 years, actually the budget fight, tax fight over Biden's Build Back Better agenda, is that we're not going to get the kinds of the investments we want, the ability to improve people's lives, unless we raise the revenue to do it. Because there's enough moderate members of Congress who basically are insisting it all has to be paid for. And so there are great ways to pay for it. I've got a menu of 40 different tax reform options to pick and choose from. The last thing I'd say is we spent a lot of time in the last couple of years on billionaires and tracking billionaire wealth growth during the pandemic. And it was quite remarkable. Over the 2.5 years, billionaire wealth growth went up by 70%. Now it's come down some. It's come down to 50%. But still, did our wealth come close to that? And these are billionaires, right? I mean, to understand a billionaire, to understand how big their wealth, the collective wealth of all America's 700 billionaires is about $4.5 trillion. That is it's about double the collective wealth of the bottom 50% of the population. Okay, so we're talking 150 million people. They have less wealth, they have 50% of the wealth as the top 700 folks. Bernie Sanders uses a figure 3 people have that. He calculates it a different way, but if you use the Federal Reserve way they calculate it, it's still a big number. It's still mind-boggling. And so one of our top priorities is to pass a billionaire minimum income tax. President Biden proposed it. Actually, Senator Wyden, who you just heard from, it was his original idea. He got President Biden to take it up. And so we've all been working hard on that. My view is, I guess I'll end with saying, if we can't at least get billionaires to begin to pay their fair share of taxes, I certainly am not doing my job. But there's something wrong with our society if we can't kind of win on that one.
Thanks, Frank. So teeing up this idea of tax equity, I want to shift gears and talk to Kat.
Hi, I'm Kat Menefee with the National Women's Law Center. So the Law Center fights for gender and racial equity across many issue areas, but as Michael said, I mostly work in tax equity. So I really want to build off of a lot of what Frank just said, in that there are many inequities built in the tax code that benefit the wealthy, benefit corporations, and lead to those huge inequities that Frank just described. But I want to talk about a way that the tax code actually helps reduce those inequities and how we can use the revenues we might raise from taxing the rich to invest back in communities of color and women and families. So I'm talking about refundable tax credits. So they are a part of the tax code that give low and moderate income families cash assistance that they need to meet their needs and help start to build wealth. And I'm going to talk particularly about two refundable tax credits, the child tax credit, or the CTC, which provides currently $2,000 to families, and then the earned income tax credit, the EITC, which provides cash assistance to low-income workers, especially low-income workers with families. And I call these the refundable tax credits, and that is really important because the refundability is where we get a lot of the racial and gender equity impact from these credits. So what I mean by refundable is tax credits reduce your tax liability. So the tax bill you get at the end of the year, a tax credit will reduce it dollar by dollar. But if you don't have very much tax liability, or if you don't make that much money and your tax bill is very low, you're not going to get the full value of that credit. But if it's refundable, then you're going to get the excess of that credit back as a refund. And this is incredibly important for low-income families. It gives them the cash that they need to start to meet their needs. And because of this, the EITC and CTC, the CTC is partly refundable, which I'll come back to later, but they're both refundable to a certain extent. Because of this, they especially benefit women, households of color, and women of color, because those groups are disproportionately represented among low-income families. So they especially benefit from these credits. Now, when we get to my work, I already talked about how great these credits are. What else do we have to do? Well, Senator Wyden brought up some of it, which is that we already have a guide for how to expand and improve these credits to make them even more beneficial to families. And this was in 2021, the American Rescue Plan expanded both the CTC and the EITC, unfortunately only temporarily for 1 year. So what it did for the EITC is made it more beneficial for workers that don't have children at home. As I said before, they only get a small credit. And what it did for the CTC is it increased the amount, made monthly payments to families rather than a lump sum at the end of the year, and most importantly, for reasons I laid out, made it refundable, fully refundable. And we saw great gender and racial impacts from that. We saw that the EITC especially benefited essential workers and young workers of color who previously weren't able to access the credit because there used to be stricter age limits. And then those CTC monthly payments, which were $250 to $300 a month for families with children per child, we saw great impacts. It helped cut child poverty nearly in half, and that is especially among children of color. It helped parents balance caregiving and work so that they were able to work more. It helped parents pay for necessities. So by that I mean childcare, but I also mean food and bills and trying to put money away in savings. We especially saw that women of color were able to use payments to be able to pay for food and pay for those necessities. So it's especially helping the groups that we want to make sure these benefits get to. So my current work is focused on restoring those expansions, especially full refundability for CTC, which, as I said, is really just key for those racial and gender equity impacts. And, you know, a lot of the tax code isn't great, right? A lot of it helps corporations, helps the wealthy, but this is a part of the tax code that puts money directly into the pockets of people who need it.
Thanks, Kat. I want to shift gears a little bit and talk about the abuses and inequities in the student loan debt crisis. And as someone who actually took out student loans when I went to law school and is still paying them, or will be paying them soon in August, this is something that's near and dear to my heart. So let's talk to the other Kat and hear what she has to say.
Thanks, Michael. And again, yes, law school is really expensive. So, hi everyone. I'm also Kat. So I work at the Student Borrower Protection Center, and also just like Frank's org, I think our name is pretty indicative of the work that we do. So we're a national nonprofit organization, and we're solely focused on alleviating the burden of student debt. And so we do that through a mix of ways. So we do advocacy, policymaking, and litigation strategy. All of it's aimed at ending the student debt crisis. And I think, and so one thing I guess just to start about, I really loved, Michael, your framing of the first question in this panel and really talking about how does the wealth gap, how do wealth disparities inform the work that you do? And I think when you're talking about student debt, it's all about wealth disparities. Student debt is about who has access to wealth and who doesn't. So all of this is inherently a civil rights crisis when we think about the way that wealth is distributed across our country, especially when we actually look at the numbers of who takes out student debt, why, and how that also inhibits people's ability to build wealth over their lifetimes. And so just like a little bit of background on what our student debt crisis looks like, because I'm sure a lot of people in hearing stories about cancellation hear a lot of different ideas about what the typical student loan borrower looks like. But doing this work, we know that there's significantly, it's not just young people, there are a lot of older adults with student loan debt. Specifically, when we're talking about student loan debt, 1 in 5 Americans have student loan debt. So this is not just a singular issue, but it's something that affects 45 million people. And so if we think about those, 45 million people, that's also the people connected to them, the people in their household, the people around them, their communities more broadly. So also understanding how expansive this issue is. But then also when we drill down into the ways that our country has a really pervasive racial wealth gap. And so what that looks like is that nearly 90% of Black students take on student loan debt to achieve higher education. Nearly 75% of Latino students take on student loan debt to access higher education. We think about 2/3 of women hold student loan debt. And then even when we're talking about those gender disparities in student loan debt, Black women have the largest balances. So even comparatively to white women, Black women hold on average, about $15,000 or $15,000 more than white women in student debt. And so one thing I want to do is sometimes like we talk about these numbers and taking a step back, but why does this happen? And so I think a lot of us have been talking about the wealth gap today, talking about disparities in our economy, but we think about the fact that one thing that I think was said so well in an earlier panel today was talking about the ways that as a country we have a history of exclusionary social programs. We talk about programs that allowed people to build generational wealth in this country. The people who are often excluded from these programs we see have less wealth and then are facing these adverse effects of the student debt crisis. So we talk about discrimination, access to credit, whether that's via redlining, whether it's via a lack of access to money for small businesses, whether it's wage discrimination or even access to employment. And we're talking about this employment discrimination. And so what that looks like is we have when Black and Latino students go to school, again, coming from more likely to come from households with less wealth, they're then more inclined to take on more student debt. What happens when you graduate school with more student debt? That's going to cut into the wealth building opportunities over your lifetime. Much harder to save for a home, much harder to start a small business, much harder just to have an emergency savings account. And so we've been talking a lot today, even about people really teetering on the edge of economic precarity. What does it mean to have an extra couple $100s a month to be able to save and to stave off some of those emergencies? And so then also what we're seeing a lot too in that phenomenon. So when that generation who has student loan debt, they decide to have they might have a family. It's time for their children, for example, to go to school. A lot of those parents still have their own student loans and then are also taking on Parent Plus loans to help support their children to go to school. And so we really see is almost this reinforcing cycle that strips wealth from communities and it disproportionately affects communities of color and especially Black and Latino communities. So what are we doing as an org to stop this? A lot of things. I know, again, I will talk about it a little bit later, talking about broad cancellation, the president's plan for broad debt relief that's being challenged in the courts, but also we advocate a lot for better federal programs because we know, one, cancellation is necessary and a meaningful step towards closing the racial wealth gap and then just broadly helping correct many of the issues we have in having a debt finance higher education system. But we also know there are existing programs within the Department of Education that are supposed to provide people pathways to relief that have not historically worked. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about issues with student loan servicing that has often kept people indebted longer than they need to be. And then also the ways that these programs haven't worked, but recent changes in the administration to try to help broaden these pathways to cancellation that previously haven't worked, as well as, we've seen movements in states also to help broaden protections for student loan borrowers. And then one other thing is, again, there are all these changes to student loan debt, but making sure people actually know about them and then how to access this relief. I do this every day, and it's still a really, really complicated system to navigate. So when we talk about how do we actually reach communities and talk about making sure that, we could say we want to close the racial wealth gap. These programs are really imperative to making sure that we're getting, getting people out of debt, but also how do we make sure that we're connecting communities to the resources that they need.
Thank you. So the work that you all covered, this is not an easy thing to do. Otherwise, we won't be here, right? But before, I want to talk to you guys about what can we do? What can the audience do? What can lawyers do? But before we get to that, I think it's really important to understand the depth and the scope of the problem and the challenges. So can each and one of you talk about some of the challenges that you've run into and some of the ongoing challenges that you're running into? And why don't we get started with, again, with Xavier.
Sure. Have these in order, but now I got to look down. So honestly, our biggest challenge is because so much of my work has to deal with Congress, it's members and their staff, right? Nobody knows. You're not taught Indian law, right? You have to go to law school, and then you have to go to a law school that specializes in Indian law to even get that. And I know you don't have a class here because one of my clerks goes to school here. So, and this is a big school, right? We're at Georgetown. So it's not something you deal with every day, but it's one of the largest law volumes in the United States. There's 52 USCs. The second largest is USC 25, which is Indian. It has 7 additional bounds to it than what you normally see in your local law library. That's because technically we're a regulated race. You don't make treaties with races, you make them with political entities. So tribes have treaties with the United States. We're a regulated race in general is how you see it every day, but they're sovereign communities. So my biggest obligation or obstruction is just teaching staff. I'm a former staffer of the Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. I was lucky to work for Senator Byron Dorgan from North Dakota and Daniel Kaka from Hawaii. That was 13 years ago. But then when we were on committee staff, we would hold like yearly Indian Law 101s. All right, we would get all the staff that we knew that we were going to deal with, who had tribal communities and areas, and we would talk to them at the beginning of each Congress, and we would do it every year. That doesn't happen anymore, and we have to individually educate members and their staff, office by office, and that's 465 members of Congress, with staff that are often very young and who rotate constantly. So it's just a continuous education process. Not only is that rough, it's hard. There's continuous litigation. There's ever-changing laws, regulations that we always have to comment on or implement or trying to figure out something. There's always something in the works. And that's our biggest obligation, is just trying to inform people. And more often than not, there's plenty of times where there's members of Congress like, oh, this is a great idea. And we have to be like, no, that is a terrible idea. Do not do that. I know you think it's good, but it's terrible. You also don't have authority, so please don't. So it's good. It's education, and it's constant, and it's all the time, and it's ever evolving. And I think a lot of the times it stems from a lot of areas, not just it takes a lot to get to this part, be like a professional in Washington, D.C., but it's not taught in elementary school. It's not taught in K through 12. It's not taught in undergrad. So there's plenty of opportunities to start to develop that education. Because if I have to teach you something, by the time you get up here, there's a lot of opportunity that I've missed, and we're trying to do that as well. I work with a lot of education, school boards, 33 school boards actually. So that curriculum is taught in our schools, mainly because we're tribal elementary K through 12 schools. But it's something that's implemented in our communities, and we try to do that with our surrounding communities, Indian and non-Indian as well. So our biggest problem is educating the people that we work with and have to deal with every day.
Thanks. So we'll go down the same order moving forward. Frank, why don't we go to you? What are some of the challenges that you're seeing in your work? I know.
Entire political party was like, no tax pledge from American tax reform, basically every group we elected to Congress don't say that's the pledge. They're not going to increase taxes unless they cut taxes elsewhere to balance that. So the entire political, Republican political party. So you can't do anything unless you can't do anything unless you've got full, one party control, the Democrats, which is what happened in the last 2 years. Second thing is we got basically the entire corporate America is against us too. I mean, all the major corporations in America are fighting here in Washington. They're here for three things. They either want to get tax breaks out of Congress, they want to get spending out of Congress so that they can run their business, or they want regulatory relief. So it's, actually, I'm remembering now the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act that passed in the Trump tax cut, in 2017. 7,000 corporate lobbyists worked on that bill, and there's 12,000 registered lobbyists in this town. So, I mean, we're talking a lot of people, okay? And on our side, we have maybe, I don't know, 3 full-time lobbyists, maybe we've got 3 or 4 people. Talking full-time lobbyists. Yeah, it's some other folks, maybe we've got 30 people, part-timers, but we're talking about against 7,000 folks. And their big agenda at the end of the last Congress was they were trying to get 3 tax breaks that were expiring. 2 expired last year, 1's expiring this year, renewed. These were tax breaks they got in the Trump tax law, but they were put on a short leash. They only ran for about 5 years because they ended it to make it look like, oh, there was a tax increase at the end, and they were using that tax increase at the end to pay for the tax breaks they got the first 5 years. But of course, they come back after the 5 years and say, well, we'll just keep renewing it. So in the end, we never pay for it. $500, $600 billion is the cost of those 3 tax breaks alone, and big priority. And then you've got Fox News and the entire, conservative establishment out there fighting our agenda. And then we even have uneven support among Democrats. I mean, I hate to say it, but a lot of folks, for 40 years, we had, the kind of notion that supply side trickle down economics, tax cuts was the way to grow the economy, the way to create jobs, et cetera. And finally, people are learning that that's not true. It doesn't really work that way. Usually what ends up happening is you get a big deficit off of those big tax cuts. But the concern was that you lose your election if you're a tax hiker, right? If you want to raise taxes, or the Republicans will. So we have a lot of Democrats, moderate Democrats, who are very weak, very uneven on these issues. And lastly, I would just say about our own advocacy community. For a long time, and partly the reason we were created, for a long time, folks working in progressive politics were advocating for housing, education, healthcare, child tax credit, child care. And they were doing it, not saying that they wanted it paid for or how you were going to pay for it. They just wanted it. They wanted those investments. They wanted that spending. And so the politicians were only hearing one side of the argument. And that's changed. It's changed because of the reality of deficits and things like that. And because we couldn't just get, in the last Congress, we couldn't get the Inflation Reduction Act passed unless it was fully paid for. And President Biden, to his credit, when he ran for president, said, here's my $5 trillion plan and it's fully paid for. So they're pretty, it's a pretty challenging environment. Oh, lastly, funding from foundations and rich people. The amount of funding that goes into tax work is not very much. And it's because, because it's very partisan, right? I said, on one side is Democrats, on the other side is Republicans, and a lot of foundations don't like to be that partisan. And rich folks, they're happy to advocate, to give money to groups that are pushing for childcare, as long as they don't have to pay for it. So.
Thanks. Let's turn over to one of the cats, Kat Menifee. Can we talk about your work and the challenges that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I'm also advocating for tax policy, federal tax policy with Congress members. So some of the same problems that Frank just described. Though I will say, most everybody admits that the CTC and EATC expansions were a great success, right? We saw, all these great benefits. Everybody agrees, but yet we have problems we weren't able to get it extended, and now we're not being able to get it restored. And so there's some reasons for that. So I want to go back to that sort of concept of full refundability that I talked about last time and how important that is for the racial and equity impacts. Unfortunately, some lawmakers oppose full refundability because they think that tax credits should be tied to work. And so they oppose, any refundability that would allow, everyone to receive the full value of the benefit, even if they don't have an earned income. And as I said, the American Rescue Plan made the CTC fully refundable, and that's where we saw a lot of the great benefits. So I talked about how child poverty was cut in half. 87% of the CTC anti-poverty impact was driven by full refundability. And then you have 19 million children in households that won't receive the full value of the credit unless it's fully refundable. And those 19 million children are disproportionately children of color. It's 45% of Black children and 39% of Latinx children. And these are children that won't receive the full value of a credit that's meant for them, right, unless it's fully refundable. And it's also just to think about, who are we harming when we don't allow the lowest income people to receive the credit? We're harming those who are disabled, so they're not able to work, or they're not able to work enough to get the earned income. We're hurting people who already have barriers to the labor market from gender or racial discrimination, and we're hurting caregivers who actually are already doing a lot of work in the home, but that work isn't represented in the tax code, so they don't get the tax benefits from it. So full refundability, incredibly important, but we're having a hard time being able to, even convince people who recognize that it was a great success, the CTC was, but they don't want to be fully refundable. So the challenge is to push back against negative narratives around benefits. And fortunately, the 2021 expansions gave us a lot of studies and things to fall back on when making those arguments. Studies show that families who received the monthly payments in 2021 didn't work less than other families, right? Receiving that $250, $300 per child every month helps them a lot, but it's not going to make them not work, right? That's not enough. It's not enough money to raise children. It just is something that helps them, and in fact, what helps many families be able to afford the paid care they needed in order to work. We also have seen in surveys that the vast majority of workers, 97 to 99%, would still work if the CTC were made permanently expanded, right? It's just an argument that doesn't bear out from how we've seen it actually play out in real life. Other challenges, and this fits a lot with what Frank was saying, is this idea that the tax credit expansions are too expensive, right? We did it for that 1 year because we were responding to the pandemic, and we can never do it again, even though it changed everything and helped child poverty. We can't do it. And Frank has given us a lot of ways that we could do that, right? We have all these revenues available to us from the wealthy corporations, wealthy individuals. We could be taxing them more equitably and using those revenues in order to fund programs like the expansions to the CTC and EITC, though Frank did outline some challenges in order to make that happen. I also just want to say that when we invest in programs like this, we invest in programs that help women and communities of color, you see a high return on investment. Research has shown that if the American Rescue Plan CTC expansions were made permanent, it would provide billions of dollars in social benefits because it would improve children's future earnings, their health, and their longevity. If we give them that support in childhood, it carries all the way over into their adulthood and has tremendous social benefits. So those are our challenges, but also I think a lot of great ways that we can shift the narrative to hopefully get over those challenges.
Thanks. All right, so let's move on to the other
Other
cat.
cat. Well, I'm actually going to draw on something that Kat just said. Is really talking about there are a couple of many challenges that we see in this space. I'm going to talk about a couple of them, and one of them I want to start is also this narrative. I mentioned this kind of earlier in my opening about like who has student debt and who is actually deserving of relief from our government. In one of the earlier panels, I really appreciated people talking about even these conversations about who we consider even deserving of relief from the federal government. And so a lot of times in this work is even reframing the narrative about student debt. So often, people throw a range of arguments out about, student loan borrowers, but not thinking about the fact that, costs have risen exponentially in the past decade and a half, thinking about the way that we invest less as a government, both how we invest less as a government in in actual higher education. Again, going to these higher upticks in student debt, but also really this idea of the fact that, you know, we've realized now for decades, we've really acknowledged that the student loan system as it exists does not work. We've acknowledged that the public service loan forgiveness program is broken. We've acknowledged that borrower defense is broken. We've acknowledged, you know, TPD, which is a program, a form of disability discharge called total and permanent disability discharge, has been broken. We know that income-driven repayment has been broken. So we've acknowledged these programs have been broken. And so this idea that we wouldn't take meaningful steps to not only address systemic issues in the form of, you know, decades, centuries of discriminatory policy that has created, you know, our wealth gap, that has created, like, you know, disparities in student debt, but then also an acknowledgement that the programs that are meant to help give people pathways to debt relief aren't working. So if we've acknowledged that the system is broken, accepting the status quo is not okay. And so a lot of it is talking about how do we change this narrative about making sure that in addition to providing this broad-based relief, to fix this system, that we one, provide the relief, but then two, we fix the broken system. So let's one part is just talking about this narrative of student debt, and also who has student debt. People love to talk about rich student loan borrowers, and I'm like, where? It really, I mean, if you're rich, you don't have student loan debt because you don't need money to take out debt to go to school. And so really thinking about the fact that nearly 40% of people who have student debt don't even have a degree. And so not only do they have this debt, but may not have the job that provides them the means to be able to pay off that debt. And so really thinking about the ways that student debt only just like really exacerbates so many of the other disparities that people are facing broadly in our economy. Other issues that we face, again, a lot of times, you know, people talk about, you know, student loan borrowers, and a lot of times placing the blames on the borrowers rather than a broader broken system. And we've known that about documented abuse in terms of student loan servicing. So student loan servicers, the people who are responsible for taking your student loan payments, supposed to tell you about your access to affordable payments through income-driven repayments, are supposed to tell you that, you know, if you're a teacher, you can access public service loan forgiveness. We know it's well documented. You know, there's been a history of, for example, servicers steering people into costly forbearance rather than telling them that, you know, your income might qualify you for a low or $0 income-driven repayment plan, or people who servicers who may not have been keeping track of people's payments. When payment counts are really important when people are trying to access certain cancellation programs, for example, public service loan forgiveness or income-driven repayment. Those payment counts are those are their steps towards cancellation. So if someone's not keeping track of your 120 payments, it's really hard for people to actually access relief, or even people being given misleading and incorrect information. And so when people are asking about different programs, what are the qualifications, what do they need, sometimes people aren't always even given the right information. And so one, it's a challenge actually making sure that, you know, we are that there's sufficient oversight of servicing and making sure that we're holding services accountable for these kind of acts. But then two, also really elevating those issues so people know, like, the struggles that borrowers are going through in the student debt system, and then also fixing those programs, which is another part of the challenge. And we've seen changes to these programs over the course of this administration. So we've seen the Department of Education last year had the public service loan forgiveness waiver, which was supposed to relax some of those rules to fix a lot of those administrative burdens that kept people, you know, from actually accessing debt relief. The Department of Education right now is still going through an income-driven repayment account adjustment, again, to correct for the fact for so many years, people were steered into forbearances instead of income-driven repayment plans. For example, there have been fixes to TPD, again, the total and permanent disability discharge program. There have been fixes to borrower defense repayment for people who've been defrauded by for-profit colleges, or even for people who are in default. There's a program called Fresh Start to help people get out of default. So that way, when payments turn back on, people are not continued to be subjected to administrative wage garnishment, treasury offset, and so all of these other really deeply punitive debt collection measures. So again, a lot of changes to these programs that we're pushing for and advocating for, but one challenge, making sure these changes happen as new rules come out, that these programs are implemented properly. But then two, making sure borrowers know about them is one thing to change the programs, but people even knowing about what programs they may qualify for, people understanding a lot of confusion, people saying, cancellations challenge in the court, can I still get PSLF? And I'm like, yes. And so even people's ability to understand this deeply complex system and what works best from them. And then again, obviously a very big challenge when, the president announces a broad debt relief program that could benefit more than 40 million Americans. 20 million people would see their debt wiped out entirely. For that to be challenged by the courts is very difficult. Again, we've been talking about earlier today, the power of again, people having more cash in their pocket, more flexibility in their month to month, and how transformative that can be for changing people's economic outlooks and really working towards erasing the racial wealth gap. And so when we think about, these programs being blocked in the court that are not only just broadly applicable, Judy, borrowing a line from you, I mean, that is, that applies to a lot of people. It's a broadly applicable issue, but then specifically when we're talking about closing the racial wealth gap, a program that not only provides, could provide debt relief for upwards of 40 million people, but thinking about what does it mean for nearly 50% of Latino people who have student loan debt to see their debt wiped out by this cancellation program, to see nearly a quarter of Black people who have student loan debt to see their debt wiped out by this program, and for that to be upheld in legal challenges, or even the thought of a company like SoFi suing to end the payment pause because they can't force people to refi their loans. What does it mean to face these kind of challenges when we see we're on the cusp of providing really substantial economic relief to people, really changing this broken student loan system, but are constantly bombarded by challenges?
Thank you. As a recovering housing attorney, I'm loving the discussion of taxes and debt. And to be honest, to be frank, I see a lot of these issues crop up with the clients I've worked with who've gotten evicted, right? These things often intersect and overlap, especially if you're someone living in poverty. What can, and now I want to go back to this question, what can the legal community do to support these efforts? How can we get involved? What can advocates do? What else can and should be done? And looking ahead, what else can be done? And there's a reason why, I'm not a trial attorney, because I love throwing compound questions to my panelists. So I apologize. But I'm hoping that you can answer these questions. So let's go in the same order. I'll start with Xavier.
Yeah, it's a comment on caps. Why is there so much interest rate being held on federal student loans? Why is it so high? Like, even now, I can get a home loan that's lower than the federal student. Sorry, said that in a minute.
You're for it.
So that's my argument. Just lower the interest rate, probably pay it off. So what can you do? Kind of educate yourself, basically. If you find yourself, or you find yourself in you or your client or your community or your firm in a position where you have a question or anything about tribes at all, ask a tribal expert. More often than not, our problems come from other attorneys or other people in our legal community who think they know, but they don't. And that's one of our bigger problems. But again, about education, it's just seeking out assistance is helping find a way to fix that gap. And we're more than welcome to help teach you. I love talking about our problems in tribal communities, but how to achieve those things. But it's funny that we're kind of talking about like the CTC. Some tribal communities, the average income on the Pine Ridge Indian Reservation is $14,000 a year. We didn't even qualify to receive the credit anyway, because there's no economic development. And there's no economic development because we keep getting taxed from our natural resources by states, which is dual taxation. We can't even get to that problem. And we're still trying to find our way to stop states from attacking us so we can develop our natural resource, so we can eventually hit the income limit so we can get a tax credit back. So we're still so far behind in advocating for ourselves. If you see a position of a tribe or tribe community who's also in that predicament, we all are, reach out to any of us. We're more than welcome to help. In DC alone, I'm a member of the Native American Bar Association. I'm also the co-chair of the DC's Native American Bar section. So we're small, but there's actually quite a bit of us. You just ask a question, we'll be here to help.
Frank.
Oh, so a few things. One is, hey, taxes are sexy. You know, for a long time, 10 years, 11 years ago, we started our organization, and it was like in some ways like pushing rock, big boulder up a hill. And suddenly it's actually become like this big thing, you know, because the budget and we had Trump's, in a way, Trump's conservative, you know, right-wing tax reform helped educate people about the problem with the tax system, and he made it a lot worse. It's the first time we actually won the message war. This is a big tax cut that was happening, but we tracked the polling. A lot of it was the polling we did and being coordinated on messaging with people on the Hill. And you saw how we were winning the message war, even though they won the legislative fight. And then in 2018, in the election in 2018, we won the message war again, and their candidates weren't running on the tax law that they passed. They still ran the more tax as than anything else, but it was about just generally Democrats are taxers and spenders. My point is that taxes are suddenly shifted to being we're on offense, whereas they're on defense now, and the public gets it. Public is so on our side. So I would just say, hey, even if you're not, I know you have some tax law work here because I've worked with Brian Gall, I think it is. Anyway, to the extent that so taxes have become a lot more interesting to people. So take a look at it. You know, it's almost sexy. Second is, hey, if you can do an internship, you know, go to Congress, or you want to get out and you want to actually work on Congress and want to become a legislative assistant. You know, hey, take the tax portfolio as part of your economic portfolio and kind of get into it that way and kind of become, you know, see this work is so central to addressing inequality. And I guess lastly, I'd say, if you go and work for an anti-poverty organization, a housing group, education group, whatever, please take the tax issue to that organization, that perspective, as I talked about it before, that perspective to that organization, that it's just not just about spending, it's about also, we can pay for it, and we win the public support much more when we say how we're going to pay for it. We lose it because a lot of the public's not into deficit spending. A lot of the public doesn't actually trust Washington spending. But if you tell them the rich and corporations to pay for it, the support goes up about 15 percentage points. So, you know, bring it to the advocacy work. If you're going into the advocacy world on behalf of people, bring it to that perspective as well.
All right. Making tax sexy. That was my takeaway. Kat, what do you have to say?
Well, so obviously, if you already work in policy, support the expanded CPC and EAPC whenever it comes back up. I think there were also panels earlier today about guaranteed income. You know, there's a lot of different ways that we can provide unrestricted cash assistance to families. And I think supporting those proposals, advocating for them, and making sure that anything you support reaches all families, right? Reaches the lowest income families that need it most. But I wanted to go to what Frank said about the message wars, because I think that's huge, especially when it comes, well, I think when it comes to anything, but for tax. So I talked a little bit about narratives around, you know, needing tax credits to be tied to work. And what I wanted to point out is that this is beyond just CPC, it's beyond just taxes. It's really anything to do with any benefits that help women and families, right? There is this narrative that, you know, you should have to earn it, that you should have to work in order to get benefits, which means that the families that need it the most do not receive those benefits, right? And so the message that comes from people who oppose these benefits is that people with income, women, people of color, would not work enough or would not spend their money wisely if they got these benefits without earning it first. Obviously, these are rooted in racial and sexist stereotypes, right? This is not rooted in reality. We saw that in 2021 when we saw how people were spending those monthly payments. They were spending it on the needs of their families. But yet this narrative persists, and this narrative helps prevent benefits from coming into place that would help families. So pushing against that wherever it shows up, right? Showing up in a lot of benefit spaces right now. It's showing up in housing, it's showing up in SNAP. You know, it's very important to push back against that. And then I also want to come back to something else Frank said about you know, investments and where we spend our money and how we think about money, you know, when people say we cannot afford the expanded CPC, or we can't afford affordable housing, we can't afford these benefits, that's really a value statement, because we know that we're giving a lot of money to wealthy individuals and corporations. We're giving them a lot of tax benefits, and yet we can't invest in women and families. We can't invest in communities of color. That's a value statement. That's saying that what we care about as a society, and that's the narrative we need to put forward. That we can't, we do have the money to invest in families, we just aren't. It's available to us. So, you know, really wherever you can, and in whatever space makes sense, you know, doing those narratives. And then I'll just say, if you want to get sort of more brass tacks, you know, into the directly helping low-income families, taxes are really complicated. It can be really hard for low-income families to navigate, or anybody to navigate the tax system. And many, you know, families end up going to paid tax preparers to try to get their tax returns done just because they don't know how to navigate it, or they don't get the tax benefits that they need because they just don't do tax returns. So, you know, the IRS's VITA program, Voluntary Income Tax Assistance Program, is always looking for volunteers. It's closed for this tax season, I believe, because I tried to do it. But they'll be open next tax season so that you could actually help low-income families get free, and that's free tax return filing advice. I'll also say that on the policy side, there's you know, policies out there or proposals out there that would make tax filing more simple for families. Those are also things to support. But in general, I think keeping in mind that message that we can invest in families, we just need to think how we think about it.
Move on to the next cat.
It's fun. I guess we'll start with like one thing, because I know people are coming here from different spaces. Some people might be more policy focused. Some people might be in direct services. Some people just a mix of different of practices here. So just going to kind of broadly give a mix of ways that people can engage. I think one part is, I think that's really important is that, you know, three or so years ago, I remember telling people about, talking about, doing this at cancellation work. And again, many of my colleagues have been doing this work for much, much longer. The idea of getting to this point where we actually had not only a president and multiple candidates talking about student debt cancellation on the campaign trail, we got to the point where the president actually did say, I'm going to propose this broad campaign for debt relief. That is because of, that really is because of people power. That's because of organizations, so many attorneys, so many people working together and really building coalition to talk about the importance of these issues, doing this research, fighting the consumer protection fight every day, but really this broad coalition of people talking about the importance of student debt cancellation, what student debt means in communities, and how much this relief can be transformative. And so one way to engage is just one saying that this is, if anyone's interested, there's a way for everyone to be part of this. And so again, whether it's just, learning more about these issues and just saying, how can I, lend whether it's my organization's voice to these issues and talking about this is something that we work in, but also, so there's like that one part about joining in the policy conversation and saying, my organization may not do debt work, but we do, some form of economic empowerment work and realizing that nexus. But then there's also the piece of realizing, especially for a lot of people who have client-based work, is again, going back to changing this narrative about people who have student loan debt. And again, I was really appreciative listening to a lot of the other panels today and realizing a lot of these groups overlap. So for example, if you're working with people on guaranteed basic income, a lot of those people also probably qualify for a $0 student loan, like a $0 income-driven repayment plan. I know we're currently in the payment pause, but payments are set to resume later this year. So talking about how do we make sure that we're providing people working in these spaces with information about these programs, because a lot of them overlap. And so making sure that people who need these resources the most, for example, people who might be in default. So again, when payments are set to turn back on, people who might be subject to wage garnishment, can we make sure that we're working and making sure those people are getting out of default? Are there organizations For example, like, are we making sure that people in our organizations know about their access to debt relief through public service loan forgiveness? So really realizing that we have a lot of connection points to people who do have student debt and connecting to the resources that they may need. So again, there are many ways to engage in this fight. And then also, it's a really big consumer protection fight. There's a lot of this work going on in the states and really changing the landscape. I know I've talked a lot about federal programs, but also to the extent that people are interested in doing more expansive student debt related legislation in their states. We've seen a lot of this movement, whether it's people doing more work on institutional debt and looking at the ways that institutions hold students and alumni's transcripts or their diplomas for owing the school money on debt, or if we talk about the ways of having private student loan registry bills, so we actually understand who's lending in states beyond the federal government. And then also just broadly borrower bills of rights. So some states have student loan ombuds, people who are actually able to provide either more information, more direct assistance, be an advocate in their states. And so there are many ways to engage. And so again, if anybody's interested in learning more, happy to connect on that next.
Thank you. Now, before we end today's panel, I want to open it up for questions from our wonderful audience who've been patiently listening. And I think the fact that no one dozed off or fell asleep, we've made progress on making the tax and debt sexy, right? Like, I think that's an incremental success that I would celebrate today. So do folks have any questions? And I guess I don't know if there are questions from online as well.
Sorry, I was going to ask you offline because it's kind of a specific question, but you were very diplomatic in talking about how the debt relief programs didn't work. I won't be as diplomatic. There was active sabotage in the last administration against those debt relief programs. And so, and a lot of this had to do with the problems with for-profit schools, because there is a real connection between for-profit schools, student debt, and people not being able to finish their degrees because they were being ripped off anyway. And so I kind of lost track of where we were. So sort of two questions. One is, have we repaired the damage that was done to the regulations on for-profit colleges? Because I can't remember. And then two, how do we protect against a repeat? And I would love to think that we will never have a repeat of the prior 4 disastrous years, but looking where our country's going, it's a scary thought. So how do we protect against what was actual sabotage by our government against its citizens?
I'm sorry, I was just gonna stand out for you first of all. I'm very excited. I just think you're incredible. So I'm like, wow. I think the first one is, at least in this administration, parts of the borrower defense process were like streamlined to make that process a little less administratively difficult. Like, I mean, honestly, a lot of these programs are just administrative nightmares is the easiest way to say it. And so there were processes to streamline that. And I think he's referring to also there was the Cardona v. Sweet. And so there is a class of people who had borrower defense claims against like an entire, like just many for-profit colleges that essentially were just outright deceiving students. And again, there's like a whole list of offenses we can talk about, the ways that for-profit colleges have preyed upon students, particularly women, Black students, Latino students, veterans. Like there's just a whole host of issues with that. And so we have seen some updates with that. But I think to your point, like there's a lot to be done because again, we've seen these sweeping changes, but how do we not get here? One, I think, again, part of it is like just one is a really big consumer protection piece. And I think to your point about student loan servicing is that we have regulators that are and should continue to really have a deep look at student loan servicing. And I'll give one example. So I talked a little bit about the public service loan forgiveness waiver. Part of the reason why this department initiated that waiver is because, again, the public service loan forgiveness program for 14 years prior had been an administrative nightmare. People weren't really able to navigate the process. There was over like a 98% denial rate for people who actually applied for this program. the program should be pretty simple. You work in public service for 10 years, you pay your student loans, your debt's canceled, but that's not the reality of it. And so again, what we saw is through, a whole host of service and misconduct, not counting people's payments. When people switch their servicers, and again, not always your choice, you get transferred to a different servicer, people will lose their entire payment count. People weren't told that they had the wrong type of loan or wrong type of repayment plan. Things that at the outset would have been very easy to fix, but 10 years and you think you're about to get cancellation and someone's like, actually you're at zero, is deeply devastating. And so to that point, some of these administrative fixes have tried to correct errors for the past, but like moving forward, one, you have to like make sure these programs work. And we have, new rules coming in July, but two, making sure that the CFPB is really supervising this and saying, Mohila, for example, student loan servicer responsible for public service loan forgiveness, really looking at these practices and looking at the ways that, student loan borrowers, consumers are really being mistreated, how they're being preyed upon in other parts of the student loan market. So I talked a lot about programs today, but I think Judy brings up a really good point of that consumer protection is a really big part of that, and that can't be overlooked for the fact that, we have these rules of the road. They're supposed to follow these rules, but we've seen that has not been what's happened in practice. And so we can fix, these programs, and unless we have like a really rigorous consumer protection efforts, we might we'll continue to see these same problems. And then it's also another plug too for enhanced state protections. To your point, Judy, like what happens in a different administration, what happens, and that's actually something we saw in the previous administration, where we saw a lot of states really step up and pass, more expansive protections for student loan borrowers because there was less federal oversight. So just making sure we have at every single level this protection, this oversight, ensuring that everything's in line. But there's a lot to be done.
I believe there was a question over there.
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. I'm just pretty curious. You raised a very important issue about students who have obtained these loans but couldn't complete their degree. And I was wondering if there has been any solution to address that issue, or if you have thoughts what that would look like.
Really great question. And I think that's one of the aims of talking about, for example, one having cancellation. And I know Judy brought up one example of for-profits being a really big reason why you have nearly 40% of student loan borrowers who have some college but no degree. But then there are also programs, there are many reasons why people don't finish. And I think cancellation is a way of, one, providing that relief, but then two, again, talking about these other. This is going to be me getting a little bit out of my student loan space, right? Because again, people had livable wages. We made sure we didn't have, employment discrimination. We didn't have a racial, we didn't have, wage discrimination by race, wage discrimination by gender. That there would be many more ways that people could actually afford to live. And so it's a slightly different answer for my student debt question, but within my student debt hat, I think that is why we also have these other programs where there's supposed to be pathways to relief. So for example, if someone was defrauded by a for-profit college, borrower defense should have and should be a pathway for them to say, I was deceived. I was told this, someone lied to me about, graduation rates. Someone lied to me about the prospects of me getting a job. I shouldn't have to have this debt. Someone should be able to say, if I have an income-driven repayment plan, again, my payment is tied to a portion of my discretionary income. And again, as an advocate, there are arguments about how much of your discretionary income the Department of Education. So right now, for example, if you have an income-driven repayment plan, I know this is for a lot of people, especially a lot of people in school who are currently in school now may have never experienced this because we've been in the payment pause for 3 years. But generally, the income-driven repayment plan, your payment is tied to 10 or 15% of your discretionary income based on a calculation by the Department of Education. And so one of the things too is about how do we protect more people's that calculation of discretionary income. So even when people are paying, that 10 or 15% of that income, they actually have more of their take-home pay. So again, even if you have debt and no degree, you're still able to live. And so a lot of it's also about, even the way that we structure our repayment program and what is actually like a meaningful, like living wage, how do we even define those parameters? There's also a lot too within the program about even how they are actually implemented, how they operate, where there are also opportunities, again, for them to be better programs in order for people to actually be able to survive. And I know we're getting new rules this year, so some of that has like already been decided for some of the regs, but that's also part of the advocacy too, is understanding the lived experience of borrowers and knowing that, so again, I know that doesn't quite answer your question about like completion, but also like I think from our perspective as debt people, it's also about how do you make sure that our student loan system actually just operates in a way that functions for people. Yeah, I mean, I would just say cancel debt, but that's that's me and my personal advocacy hat. But that's a different.
I'm also fine with that.
I think we're good. We've done it. We solved it.
Yeah, I have a question. The federal student loan program was an initiative of President Johnson. I think it was the State of the Union address in 1965, and it was created under the Higher Education Act of 1965, actually. And I'm wondering to a certain degree, is this a chicken or an egg issue? In other words, did the skyrocketing increase in tuition, is it directly attributable to this readily available money that the federal government provides to students that are maybe not appreciating how much debt they're taking on and what that means for their future? Myself, when I graduated from law school, I graduated with $85,000 in student loans. I can't even imagine how much the students are graduating with student loans today.
Like 1 year.
Yeah. I'm sorry. That's horrible. And what's amazing is just 12 years before I graduated, a colleague of mine graduated from the same law school, and he was able to pay for his entire law school through his summer job. And that opportunity doesn't exist anymore. It didn't exist 12 years later when I graduated with $85,000 in student loan.
And I think an important thing about acknowledging that opportunity doesn't exist, not only has the cost risen, but wages have stayed stagnant, right? So like it's literally impossible to pay for your law school tuition with a summer job. It's very difficult. And so I think but what we're talking about is how do you tackle having a debt finance higher education, and to Kat's point about where do we place our values and saying like we can't afford this. I mean, we technically can't afford to put more investment in higher education, so we don't have to finance education through debt. We can invest in communities and households to make sure that there are equitable pathways to higher education. And so to be clear, I don't want to say like no, because for many people right now, the only pathway to higher education is debt. And so part of this is understanding too, when you're like, well, maybe do students understand the debt? That's for many people, that's the only option. And so I think it's also to take a step back, because that would then significantly limit the opportunities for many people, again, who don't come from wealthy households to be able to attain higher education. I think the problem is when we tie people's access to social mobility to a lifelong debt sentence. And so it's really about how do we make sure that either on the front end, we invest in this higher education and make sure that people don't have the loans, or if we do have this, how do we make sure that we're making it function in a way that people aren't paying on their loans for 15 years, 20 years, 30 plus years, and literally seeing their balances growing. Not only is that deeply predatory in any other market, it is a predatory loan, right? And so really thinking about the ways that we even change our mindset about debt. I don't think we should take it for a norm that it's okay and again, this is something that proposals and new plans to fix, but this idea that, your interest can balloon and then you're stuck with this debt and you're never able to pay it down. And again, when the programs don't work, that debt's not getting canceled. So but I do want to correct the fact, I'm not saying because again, the way our program exists, many people can't access school without loans. But I think it's about fundamentally, how do we, as a country, think about the way that we finance our higher education system?
Other questions? Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us today. That concludes our panel. Up next is our reception at the DC Bar featuring remarks by Dorothy Brown. So please join us at 5:30 p.m. At
5
DC or 5,
Five.
5 p.m. And let's just give our wonderful panelists a round of applause.
And let's thank our moderator, Michael Santos.